The broom made a single, private rhythm against the marble, as if it were keeping time with a heart. Victoria James Okoro moved along the quiet corridor with the economy of someone who had practiced the same small acts for years. One hand steady on the broom, the other cradling the wooden box she kept on her person like a talisman. The morning light from the double doors made the polishing on her sleeve brighter. Her shoes made no sound. In her small room at the back of the staff quarters, she had learned to treat motion itself as prayer. Deliberate, respectful, precise. It steadied her. The box fit into her hands the way memory fits into a life. Smooth wood warmed by years, edges softened by the friction of closing and opening. Inside were the things that made her private world hold together. A folded dress, thin and unassuming, the color of dusted gold. A ring that had stretched and tightened with her moods and with the fingers that had worn it before. Isabel's voice folded into the metal like a script. A bent hairpin. One faded photograph that showed a man smiling beside a hospital bed. She touched the ring where the metal met metal, felt its cool weight. Her mother had told her once, in a voice that stitched ordinary wisdom into the long evenings, that clean hands were proof of a life lived. The ring, she had said, is proof of a name kept. Victoria smoothed the dress over her knees. The silk sighed, thin as a promise. She had worn it once before, at a church service when the sky had been too stern for celebration. Her fingers remembered the hem, the way the fabric came to life under light. Today, the dress would be a shield and an announcement, both. When she folded the box closed, she heard for a quarter second her mother's laugh. Soft, incredulous, pleased. It steadied her. The gold envelope arrived the week after the column appeared. It had been left on her trolley, placed there like a prank at first. Heavy card, embossed curl of an unknown crest. Only the name in a hand that did not belong to the cleaner's staff list. The envelope smelled faintly of jasmine and the sealed place where red wax had once sat. She had turned it in her hands, feeling the ridged edge, the sudden quality of the object that meant somebody had noticed, or wanted to be noticed. The embossed letters read, Victoria J. Okoro. Invitation to the Okoro Foundation Annual Gala. The type was small and exact, the kind of small and exact thing people paid to have done for them. She had carried it home the way one carries news whose shape is uncertain. At the sink, she rinsed her hands and watched the water run clean before she sat and opened it. Inside, an invitation, a line that named her, and a single phrase that made her look at the photograph in the wooden box with a new, considered attention. Guest of honor, family of Henry Okoro. Henry Okoro had been a name in stories around the neighborhood, the patriarch whose hands had guided a company that had become a city landmark, and whose death had left rooms too large for mourning. There had been talk when Henry died, how could there not be? The sharp-edged talk of suspicion and quiet accusations. The official line had been careful and precise. A funeral had been a polished event. Flowers had been arranged as if to make an argument about love. The rumors had been the thing that passed from mouth to mouth, not proof. Victoria listened to them as one might listen to thunder far away, knowing storm could come without meaning it would touch you. The photograph in her box had been left tucked behind a letter in her mother's handwriting. If ever they call you lesser, tell them the truth is heavy and will not fit into a pocket. She had obeyed the instruction to keep the photograph, not to make it argument. The galas at Okoro Holdings were the sort of thing that would be in magazines later. Chandeliers like constellations, marble that reflected the high heels and the patience of a polished smile. Music collected and released by a string quartet and a DJ in a manner that suggested the building itself wanted to keep time with wealth. Victoria had never been invited to such gatherings. She had cleaned after them, had taken away half-glasses of forgotten cocktails and the crumbs of petit fours, had listened at the doors when laughter fell like glass, and the named families moved in the warm wash of applause. Richard Okoro loved the stage. He loved the projection of himself across a room. He liked the sway of people who orbited him and the quickness with which their eyes moved to his hand. He liked the way his watch caught light. His suit always appeared sharp enough to cut through air. He had been seen in the press often, in photographs with dignitaries, on panels, interviews where his voice carried conviction like a weapon. The stories said he was decisive. His friends said he was decisive in a way that left no room for second thought. He had presided over the foundation since Henry's death and had stood at podiums where his father's name warmed the room like a hymn. When Victoria read the line, "Guest of Honor," she had laughed, a small private thing. It might have been a mistake, it might have been an error, or it might have been the kind of gesture men like Richard made for spectacle, a chance to show magnanimity in public while keeping private contempt tidy under the table. Her first thought was to leave the invitation tucked in the box and walk on. Her second was to call Amanda, the woman who had worked cleaning in another building and who had risen to become an assistant at the foundation. Amanda answered on the second ring and said with a cheer that had practical joy in it, "Wear it, Ma, make them look." The choice felt larger than the dress. To go was to step into a story that belonged to others and to walk it on her own feet. To stay was to accept the perimeter that had been drawn by other people's assumptions. She packed the wooden box into her bag with a tenderness that felt like the closing of a door. And when she touched the ring, she felt faintly like someone who would keep a secret for long enough to make it true. The gala was a machine of light. The double doors opened to reveal a red carpet and an atrium that smelled like citrus and perfume. Victoria's dress moved like quiet currency beneath the chandeliers. Dusted gold catching the light, neither ostentatious nor mistaken. The ring on her finger made a single, careful shine. She could have worn brighter. She could have tried to be invisible. Instead, she carried herself like someone who knew the truth of her own name and refused to make it a whisper. Richard noticed her almost immediately. He had expected a room full of familiar faces and a few well-placed surprises. He had not expected the surprise to be a woman who entered as though she belonged. He watched, an instinct older than pride moving in him, to fix a spectacle that would make everyone laugh at her. He had arranged the program to include a moment of lightness, an interlude to humanize wealth. He had planned to call the guest of honor forward to say a few words about the staff who kept the foundation's life running. He pictured the small applause and a half-joke, his voice large, his grin larger, and the room would fold itself around the humor of it. The man who could reduce a person to a punchline loved the control of that moment. When Victoria walked up the marble steps, she heard, in the strangeness of the moment, the sweep of the broom in her memory, measure and return. The music softened as Richard reached for the microphone. There was a flutter of flashbulbs. Helen, beside him, smiled the way one smiles at a scene one has already imagined. She would later say she had not known, that she had thought it a kindness. Her eyes during this first exchange were wet with something like steadiness. "Victoria," Richard announced, as if the name were a specimen he was revealing to the room. His voice laced the syllables with the sort of amusement that makes the world tilt. "Why don't you tell us about your work? We love the cleaners, don't we? Where would we be without the cleaners?" Laughter fluttered like paper moths. Someone in the front row said a thing that was meant to be kind and landed thinly. She moved toward him with the quiet surety of someone who had rehearsed very little but had the memory of everything she needed. Her voice when she spoke was low and even. There was no tremor when the microphones caught it. She did not say the things that would have made a sound in the room and then floated away. She did not apologize. She did not laugh at herself. She said instead, without rhetorical flourish, "I come from the house of that man." And for a beat, the room held only the sound of someone setting a tray down with care. Richard's amusement stuttered. His mouth arranged a smile and then disagreed. A murmur moved like a tide. Guests leaned forward in the way people do when a story sharpens into something living, when a claim, reframing the shape of a family, is made in public. He tried to recover the joke, to twist it into the smallness he had intended, but her presence made a different grammar in the air. Victoria's hands were folded, and the ring on her finger caught a light that seemed to refuse him. He asked sharply now where she had learned that she belonged to Henry Okoro. The phrasing was an attempt to put her on the defensive, to show the young men in suits that there was a gap between her and the memory of the man who had been their benefactor. He liked to watch people try to explain themselves. He liked the color leave their faces. He liked the power of a well-timed interruption. Victoria took a breath. The chandeliers threw down clean pools of light. The marble resisted the echo of sound. She could, in that moment, have made a speech of accusation. She could have had a journalist in the wings read a prepared statement. She could have used the stage to exact an answer that would hum with revenge. Instead, she said, "I have some papers." And from inside her bag, she took the wooden box, the public and private colliding in a gesture that made the musicians stop playing, as if they too had been told to listen. There was a small flurry. Someone in the back called out a question about safety. Diana Musa, who had been at the edge of the room with her notebook, stepped forward before the hands could rearrange themselves into caution. She moved with a journalist's economy. No spectacle, just a quick assessment of the import of the moment. Her face in the light was an alert as much as a tool. She had been working on stories about the Foundation for months and had learned the architecture of power in the city, the way names covered deeds, and how documents sometimes went missing behind polite smiles. "May I?" Diana asked. And because the room wanted a spectacle, because Richard's people wanted to direct the drama into the channels they'd chosen, someone nodded, a weak, necessary convenience. From the wooden box, Victoria produced a thin envelope, then another, then a folded paper, and a small modest certificate of a hospital visit. The documents were not theatrical. They were domestic, the kind of paper that becomes monumental in the hands of someone who knows how to place it. She laid them on a side table with a tenderness that made people glance at their own dinner plates. "What is this?" Richard said, the edge of his voice not yet abandoning its grin. He tried to make the room laugh,
but the laughter came out thin.
Diana moved to the small projection screen because she had the presence of mind to see that a narrative needs evidence in public. She took down the small sleeves of her tablet and connected the device to the projector. The screen woke, and the string quartet plucked one nervous chord. The image that first appeared was a letterhead. Then, beneath it, a will. Henry Okoro, last will and testament, name of a beneficiary that had not been public before. The room felt for a second like a vessel that had been tilted and then set down. Someone clapped once, a reflexive thing, and then, by the tenor of the faces, everyone realized the clap was untimed. Helen's smile scattered. Richard's face narrowed. He stepped toward Diane, into the light, and when his hand reached for the tablet, he tried to make it seem like mere curiosity. His voice was controlled now, swift and cold. "What is this?" he said again, and this time there was steel under the words. Diana clicked to a second slide. It was a recorded file. The icon pulsed at the edge of the screen. The room inhaled. Dr. Hassan, a presence who had hovered around the edges for years, medical advisor to the family, rose from his seat with a gait that did not look like the gait of someone prepared to remove himself from the structure of a life he'd made a series of compromises in. He carried with him a small recorder, an act that made him look more like a man confessing a fault than an authority. "I kept it," he said, voice dry. "I have had it for a year." The sound that came through the speakers was ordinary at first. A conversation in a room, chairs scraping, a man's laugh. Then it turned colder. One could hear the soft, indirect pressure of a voice. The recorded conversation was not a dramatic scream, but a sequence of directions and a careful insistence on a narrative. The voice on the other side, the quality later recognized by every person present, was clipped and familiar. The recording contained questions about which tests would be reported, which diagnoses would be emphasized, and the suggestion, soft at first and then more insistent, that certain findings be minimalized. The effect was not the roaring indictment of a melodrama, but the quiet of a room tricked into making false peace. When the sound stopped, the room lay as if someone had put a cloth over the center of it. Music did not start again. People did not clap. Richard's face was a study in unlearning his shape. His hands, always so practiced at punctuation, found themselves empty. His voice came out small and then large in the same exhalation. "This is a fabrication," he said. "This is nonsense. Who?" Dr. Hassan lifted his head. The confession he had been avoiding until the pressure of his conscience made him do so was a small, precise thing. "I was paid," he said. "I was told to make the report simple. I allowed myself to be persuaded. I thought I could protect my career. I am sorry." The lawyers began to move. The lawyers began to move. She came with a tray of tea, a small human offering carried across a gulf that good sense had told her could not be crossed easily. Her hands, which had once placed food and directives with equal ease, trembled in a way that was not spectacle. "I am sorry," she said, and did not try to make the apology a performance. She brought her sorrow as a thing that needed tending, not as a thing she wanted forgiven. Victoria accepted the cup. She sat with Helen in a room that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and the kind of tea that announces care. There were no dramatic reconciliations. There were only two people acknowledging the ways that complicity had been formed. Fears, the small daily acts that become a life, and the edges of a marriage built in part on the politics of a man. Helen's admission was small. It was enough. "I do not know if we can be friends," Victoria said once, softly.
and Helen made a face as if the shape of that truth was not fictional. "I do not know if I want that from you," she continued, and Helen, who had imagined many redemptions, took the sentence like a measure. "But I want the people we hurt to have something better." In the months that followed, Victoria learned how to make policy and how to make restitution without the temptation of spectacle. She instituted clinics and named them. She set up training programs that taught accounting and nursing, the quiet trades that keep communities whole. The microloan recipients sent her thank you notes that smelled faintly of trade and hope. She asked Amanda to run the first application session because she believed that people who had come from the same small places understood the detail of hope. The children who were part of the restorative programs arrived like the weather, occasional, then regular. 2 little girls were given custody by a distant relative who no longer wanted the trouble of child-rearing. Victoria met them with a patience that shamed no one. They were not the centerpiece of her rescue, they were, simply, people in need. She read to them in a corner of her office during quiet afternoons, when the work required a lower gear. A child asked once, very simply, "Is Daddy a killer?" The question landed with the gravity of a pebble in a still pond. Victoria did not answer with a sermon. She knelt and offered the child a biscuit and the truth in a measure the child could hold. "Some people do bad things," she said. "Some people get punished for them, but you are safe here." The city continued to be the city. Traffic snarled in the usual ways. Dinners were held in restaurants that thought wealth the only taste that mattered. Richard's public fall had become, in some circles, a subject for late-night jokes. In others, it remained a wound. Victoria understood that her own elevation was not going to erase the quiet sharpness of years of denial. She had, however, been given a responsibility to make something practical and lasting. Once, on a morning that smelled like baked bread and the promise of rain, she opened the wooden box and found the letter from Richard. She unfolded it again and turned it over in her hands. The piece of paper had the same small fold as the photograph had. She slid it into the inner pocket of her jacket and walked out into the day, the Broom sound of the past now receding into a different rhythm, the shuffle of children at a clinic door, the click of a micro-loan receipt, the low laugh of a woman who had opened her stall and discovered she could pay for her son's school fees. There were nights when she sat at the window of the office and watched the lights make the city's face uneven and oddly human. She thought of her mother, of the small domestic lessons that age had made into a manual for living. Keep your word. Keep the things that make you stronger. Do not let others make your life into a spectacle. The ring on her finger caught the streetlight in a way that reminded her she had not stolen anything. She had only claimed a name. At the center of the work was a program she called simply Repair. It was not flashy. It provided counseling, small financial support for families dealing with loss, and mentorship for women who wanted to move from cleaning to skilled professions. At the first Repair graduation, a woman who had once scrubbed the foundation's bathrooms stood and told the room, in a voice that trembled only at edges, that she had learned to count money for the first time in her life without fear. The applause was small but real. Amanda, who had become manager of staff welfare, liked to tell the new recruits that the first thing Victoria had taught her was to listen. "She listens like she's sweeping a floor," Amanda said once to a group of interns, and they understood, because they had seen how a broom finds the dirt and leaves the floor ready. The last image of the public unspooling of power was not a televised moment. It was instead the small, precise act of opening a clinic door on a Monday morning and being met by a woman who pressed a small bundle of plantain fritters into Victoria's hand because she wanted to share the first payout from her stall. The gratitude in the woman's eyes was the kind that travels slowly across a room and changes its light. Months later, there was a quiet scene in which Victoria sat at her kitchen table, a simpler table than the heavy desk she now sometimes occupied, and watched the two girls she had taken in, coloring with a patience that held the shape of ordinary life. There was a letter from Richard in the wooden box. There was, on the table, a new stack of applications for a scholarship that bore Isabel's name. Outside, a neighbor called for the delivery of bread. Inside, someone hummed, neither a hymn nor a song, only the steady cadence of someone who had come through a long moment and found a small ethical purpose at its end. She had not sought spectacle.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "Purpose at its end." She had not sought spectacle. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. She had not wanted a vindication that seared like a brand. The things she had done were not bright flashes. They were practice and structure. When the children leaned against her and asked about their future, and she told them about apprenticeships and school books, she taught them how to find order in days. When Helen passed by the office window and wiped her face with a hand that had washed too many tears, Victoria gave her a nod that contained both distance and a possibility of civil living. The wooden box closed the way it had always closed, with a small sound like a promise kept. Victoria placed it back on the shelf, but not as an object that marked the end. It marked instead the continuity of the life that had once been spent out of sight and that was now, finally, allowed to be taken seriously. The ring warmed on her hand. She made tea, and the steam fogged the glass for a moment. Outside, the city moved with its usual urgency and its odd, persistent capacity for repair. She kept Richard's letter, folded and neat, like a page in a ledger that needed no answer. The work, she understood, was not finished. Repair is always a present tense. But there were mornings when the broom no longer felt like the only thing that defined her motion. There were afternoons when children read aloud in the clinic waiting room, and their voices made the space into a room of its own, not a room that belonged to someone else's name. When the lights in the office dimmed for the day and the last visitor had gone home, Victoria stood at the window and watched the streetlights flare into being. The double doors of the building gleamed like an entrance that had been refused to many and given to her in part. She walked the marble with her broom in hand, not as a servant, but as someone who had learned how to steward a space, who understood that cleaning could be an act of care, and leadership could be an extension of that service. The music of the city pulsed in a distance. The wooden box waited on the shelf. In the end, there was no display of vengeance. There was only the quiet business of making sure that what had been wronged was made right in as many small ways as could be kept alive. That was the astonishment for many of the people who watched, that power could be used to mend rather than to break. Victoria returned to her home that night with the smell of perfumed air still in her hair, but under it was the clean, steady scent of tea and wood smoke. She set the ring on her finger and slept with the box beside her bed,
the photograph of a smiling man tucked against the letter that reminded her how to hold truth, like a handhold, like a ring. There would be hearings and testimonies, and there would be days when the past leaked into headlines and made demands again. There would be spaces of grief and the meticulous work of untangling the ways people covered their actions with convenience.
But there would also be a clinic with a waiting room that had chairs for those who could not afford to stand. Scholarships that paid tuition and not just promises, and a fund that lent small sums to people who wanted to be entrepreneurs rather than dependents. The world did not become new overnight. It shifted in the slow gravity of policy and the faster decisions of people with the courage to do what was right. If anybody in the city asked later how the cleaner came to be standing behind a desk of polished wood and a nameplate that read Victoria James Okoro, Chair, Okoro Foundation, the answer was not simple. It involved a wooden box, a ring, a recording kept by a guilty man, a journalist who had the presence of mind to let evidence speak, and a lawyer who knew how to make the law do something restorative. More than that, it was the accumulation of small, brave acts, the insistence upon truth, the refusal to be diminished, and the choice to use regained power to repair. In the morning, the children she had taken in learned how to boil water for tea. Victoria taught them, with a patience that had become a practice, how to fold clothes so they could be cared for. She taught them how names could be claimed and kept. When a child asked whether there would be revenge, she shook her head and said instead, "We will make a place where people can come back from what they lost." Outside, someone was sweeping the pavement, and the sound traveled up like a small hymn. Victoria placed the wooden box back on the shelf and for a moment touched the ring as if to make sure it was still there. Proof that a name had been kept and that repair had room to take root. The doors opened to a day that smelled of market spice, diesel, and the damp faintness of new rain. She walked through them with the steady motion of someone who had both cleaned and built, who had swept and, in the sweep, made room. The clinic filled with a particular light that morning, thin, persistent, as though the day itself had been taught to be patient. Children shuffled in with cups and mismatched socks. The youngest, with a gap-toothed grin, carried a battered tin can as if it were a treasure chest. Victoria moved among them like someone accustomed to attending to many small fires, guiding a hand to tie a shoelace, teaching a slow breath through a cough, listening when a boy insisted a scar came from a dragon. There were administrative tasks waiting, a meeting with the foundation's new accountant, a call with the scholarship committee, a delivery of donated textbooks, but all of them could wait until the tea was made and the questions were answered. "Miss Vic," said Amaka, a girl with hair braided into a crown. She held her cup with both hands as if it contained something sacred. Victoria set the kettle down and let her fingers hover above the steam. It was a question that came in many forms, spoken into the teeth of a court, whispered in a hallway, asked of a photograph tucked in a wooden box. She knelt until she was level with Amaka. "No," she said simply. "People can be bad in how they act, but what they do is not the same as who they are. And even when what people do is terrible, it does not mean you have to answer with more terrible." She watched the child's face, serious and earnest. "You can choose to make something that fixes what was broken." Amaka frowned, uncertain. "Like glue?" "Like glue," Victoria agreed, because sometimes it was necessary to keep the metaphors plumb simple. "But also like a door. We make ways for people to come back." The day moved in its gentle, efficient rhythms. Students arrived to take literacy classes in the back room. A woman came to apply for a small loan to buy fabric for a stall. A young teacher sat with Victoria to plan a workshop on bookkeeping. Each encounter left residue, a list of names to call, a promise to follow up, an unfinished conversation that would be finished when the child with the dragon story returned to fetch a sock. When the city news vans began to queue along the curb, still a rare sight but no longer a shock, Victoria felt the same odd sensation she had when the ring was first placed on her finger. An awareness of weight and possibility, a responsibility that sat against her bones. The hearings were scheduled for the following week. They would be public. They would reopen old wounds and invite new scrutiny. The man whose recording had undone his reputation did not appear in the Foundation's office, but his presence was a constant hum on the air, like a faulty wire. Some wanted the courts to mete out a punishment that seemed proportionate to the harm. Others, those who had been harmed, were less sure what justice looked like when everything felt rearranged by betrayal. Victoria met with the lawyer, Amina, who had a way of plotting legal strategies as if she were arranging flowers, precise, practical, intent on beauty. "We set the terms," Amina said. She read a page of notes and tapped a paragraph with a pen. "Restorative options first, but we must make the mechanism clear. Counseling, reparations, community service that benefits the victims directly. We will ask for oversight, an independent board. And we will insist on funding for the programs, scholarships, the microloan fund, clinics." Victoria listened, feeling how the list of needs she had voiced in hospital corridors and on park benches was now being translated into legal language. "And the press," I asked. "They will want names, sound bites." "They will," Amina said, "but we control what we offer. The narrative is not their property. You were careful with the evidence. Be careful now with the telling." On the day of the hearings, the courthouse was full of faces she recognized and faces that had once been strangers.
But the presence of a repaired public conversation, one in which breaches were named and steps taken, began to alter the city's climate. Victoria returned to her old rhythms with a new cadence. She still swept the marble before meetings, though now others stood ready with trays of tea. She signed grants at a wooden desk, and still, at intervals, excused herself to sit in the back room where the children read. There she could hear the city at its edges, the diesel rumble, the rhythmic call of a vendor, the laughter that always rose from the courtyard like a small rebellion. Letters arrived, some from donors, some from families asking for aid, some from people who had been healed enough to write a thanks that asked for nothing in return. Each one landed in her hands like a stone with its own history. Night came with its old mysteries. On one late evening, after a meeting that had gone on too long, Victoria walked home through an alley that smelled faintly of frying plantain. The wooden box sat on her shelf when she returned, patient as a small altar. She took out the photograph that had been tucked against Richard's letter and smoothed the edge of the paper with her thumb. The man in the photograph, older than in memory, but smiling, looked back at her like someone who had once been part of another life. She sat with the ring in her palm, not putting it on, simply holding the circle and thinking about cycles. She had friends who wanted to know if she missed the anonymity of her earlier days, the simplicity of a broom and the invisibility it once granted. But there was no invisibility now, only the particular kind of exposure that comes with responsibility. At times, she felt tired in a bone-deep way that no amount of tea could lift. She slept with the box beside her bed, which comforted her more than she expected. There she could reach and reassure herself that a name had been kept, that something had been rescued. There were days the city still turned against them. Headlines would flare up about the hearings, then settle into footnotes. People who benefited from the old system, the arrangements, the bribes, the unspoken bargains, pushed back. An official complained about the foundation's influence over public schools. A small scandal about misuse of funds by an unrelated charity surfaced and was used to argue that civic trust was fragile. Victoria learned to take these things in. Not everything required her to defend. She let procedural mechanisms respond where they needed to respond, and she focused on the work that could be done without fanfare. In the clinic one afternoon, a man in his 50s arrived, stooped and careful. He had once been a janitor in a government building and had lost his job when his arm had been injured. He wanted to learn tailoring, if the Foundation's program could help with materials. Victoria sat with him and filled out the forms.
He told her, quietly, that in his village there had been a woman who had taken him in after his wife died. She had taught him how to mend clothes, and through that he had survived. "I want to give that back," he said. "Not everyone gets a second chance." She handed him a pencil. "Then we'll give you the second chance," she said. "And when you have work, you shall do the same for someone else." Outside, someone began to sweep. The sound traveled up the street and into the clinic like the beginning of a hymn. Victoria stepped out for a moment, leaning on the doorframe, and watched as a group of young people, former patients, volunteers, worked to paint a mural on the wall of a nearby school. The mural was a tangle of hands, bright and bluntly drawn, that reached toward a horizon of oranges and blues. It was not perfect, not technically accomplished, but it was alive. Children had stuck their hands into paint and left prints there like signatures. She thought of the wooden box, of the ring, of the recording that had been a kind of incendiary truth. She thought also of quiet things, a tea kettle, a folded shirt, a scholarship application filled with a child's small, careful handwriting. Power, she had learned, was not a single ornate thing. It was distributed, small, patient, insistently practical. You held it by choosing what it would do. That evening, a letter arrived in her mailbox, with edges softened by travel. It was from Neka. She wrote of mornings when the child she had once sheltered now laughed loudly and ran to school, of a small table that had been bought with microloan funds and was now used to mend clothes for neighborhood families. "We sew," she wrote, "and when we sew, we are mending other things as well." Victoria read the letter twice.
then folded it and placed it into the wooden box beside the photograph and Richard's letter. She closed the box and set it on its shelf, where light found it at certain hours of the day and turned the grain gold. The ring felt warm against her palm. She slipped it on, this time as an action to finish a thought rather than to test a memory. It fit as if it had been waiting for that exact day. It was not all triumph. There were nights when regret sat beside her like an unwelcome guest, and days when a policy stalled and the weight of need seemed to outstrip their resources. But there were also mornings of small, sharp joy. A student passing an exam, a tired mother finding stable work, a youth who, after a workshop, chose to register a small piece of sewing equipment and call it a business. These victories were not dramatic. They arrived in installments, in the slow calculus of lives rearranged by steady hands. On a Saturday, the foundation held its first open day. Neighbors came with dishes. The clinic opened for free checkups. A small troupe of musicians played in the courtyard.
She woke before dawn, the memory of the hum bright in her chest. Outside her window, someone had already begun sweeping. The sound traveled up and touched the room, steady as a metronome. She rose and dressed with the same quiet determination she brought to the clinic. There would be meetings today, and a visit to the school to look at the mural. There would also be paperwork and phone calls, and the delicate task of saying no when resources were finite. She took the wooden box and, for reasons she could not name, carried it with her to the clinic. It felt natural, as if a certain truth needed to be kept near when decisions were being made. At the door, children clustered to ask if she had any time for a story. She sat on the low bench and told them about a woman who learned to care for a place and then taught others to hold it. The story was plain and small, but the children listened with the solemnity of those who know the value of being seen. Outside, the city moved and repaired itself in small, persistent ways. A man fixed a broken window with a scrap of wood. A woman sewed a child's pocket back together. A neighbor shared a cup of borrowed sugar. Victoria watched these acts and felt their cumulative weight. The work was not over. It would never be. But it had begun, and once begun, it would accumulate as trouble or as grace, depending on the choices people made. She set the wooden box on a table where the morning light made the grain shine. Around it, the room hummed with the ordinary business of repair. A pencil tapping, a radio playing out of tune, the low murmur of a conversation about scholarships. Victoria folded her hands and breathed in the small, clean air of a place being tended. Power, she had learned, might always be a temptation, but it could also be a tool. What she had to decide each day was how she would bend it, toward vengeance or toward mending. She picked up the broom when a child dropped a scrap of paper, and for a moment the motion felt like an answer. The sweeping was not enough by itself, but it was part of a ritual that kept them close to what mattered. The city sang its small, persistent music. People came and went, and Victoria kept the wooden box where she could see it. It was a simple practice, keeping the artifacts of what had been, and perhaps that was the point. To remember was to remain accountable. To remain accountable was to keep doing the work. Even as the cases in the headlines wound their way through courts and conversations, as new meetings were called and old wounds reopened by examination, the children learned to boil water for tea and to fold clothes with care. That rhythm continued. Outside, someone swept the pavement, and the sound traveled up like a small hymn.